Memorial to the 28th president. Woodrow Wilson was our only president with a PhD, and the people who make memorials decided he ought to have a living memorial to encourage dialogue between the scholarly community and the policy community, and thus we have the Wilson Center. We are a nonpartisan, non-policy prescriptive institution, and we do programs like this. We get people together from different backgrounds to talk about an issue of interest. And the Canada Institute tries to bring Canada to policymaking Washington, and also we try to bring an American perspective to Canada-U.S. relations in Canada. It's a delight to have you here today. This is our 6th in our series of energy forums. We started in March 2004 in Calgary with a program, Closing the Gap, creating a collaborative cross-border business environment. And out of that program, we realized there needed to be a lot more dialogue on various aspects of the energy topic writ large. So we followed 6 months later with a program on the challenges in Canada-U.S. energy trade, which looked at mostly infrastructure. And we had a paper written for that, and I believe some of them are out there on our One Issue, Two Voices series written by Paul Ziff and Daniel Yergin. 6 months later, we did a program on the security of continental natural gas supply. And last fall, we did Discovering the Possibilities for North American Petroleum Production, which mostly looked at oil sands. And in March of this year, we looked at the North American electricity system and got some really good dialogue going there. So for those of you who have never been to one of our energy forums, the first part opens up with some presentations to set the stage. Then we turn the camera off, the webcast goes out. Any media who are here, I don't think there's any right now, get kicked out, and we have a frank and open discussion. It's not a Q&A of the panel, although you can do that. It's a Q&A of everybody. Bring issues that you've been wanting to bring up, and we're not recording it. It's not going to, nothing's going to be attributed. It's going to go no further than this room. So to follow up and do the more introductions is Colleen Killingsworth, who's president of the Canadian Center for Energy Information. The Center and Colleen have been partners on these programs for, this is our 4th or 5th one now. And it's great working with them. They can bring a great perspective from north of the border. And Colleen and her team have been really, really good to work with. So with this, I will turn it over to Colleen, and enjoy the afternoon. See us at break if you have any questions. And for the panel up here, I will leave this handheld mic up here in case you want to stand up and walk around.
Thanks, David. As David said, I'm Colleen Killingsworth. I'm the president of the Canadian Center for Energy Information, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here as well this afternoon. We have really enjoyed our partnership with the Canada Institute in hosting these cross-border energy forums. And like the Canada Institute, the Canadian Center for Energy Information supports collaborative learning and outreach approach on energy-related issues among North American audiences. We believe that an informed and educated public makes better policy choices and regulatory choices as they relate to energy, as well as better business decisions, invests in energy, and uses energy more wisely. For those of you who aren't familiar with the Canadian Centre for Energy Information, we were founded in 2002. We're a third-party, nonprofit energy information resource that provides information on all sources of energy across the Canadian energy sector. Our mandate includes building awareness and understanding for Canadian energy system and energy-related issues, and facilitating informed dialogue and discussion on those energy-related issues. We believe these cross-border energy forums have been successful in building and creating the constructive dialogue that is critical to the sustainability of our North American energy system. I'm confident that today and tomorrow's sessions will be no different, and given the caliber of our panelists and participants. Before I introduce our moderator, I would like to personally thank our partners, David Biette and his team here at the Canada Institute, Paul Connors in the Canadian Embassy, Laurie Cameron, Senator Hank Coe, and Representative John Smith of the Energy Council, and Lorraine Royer of Global Public Affairs. I would also like to acknowledge our sponsors, Paul McGregor and TransCanada, and Brian Gable and British Columbia Transmission Corporation. Without your support, today's forum would not have been possible. I want to reiterate what David said, too, a little bit about the format for this afternoon. We will start with our panel presentations, which will be webcast. Then we will take a break around 3:15 or so. We will have some coffee and some refreshments. And at that point, the webcast ends, and we will come back for a closed-door, frank dialogue amongst all of the participants here, including the panelists. At the end of that session, we will be breaking and transferring over to the Canadian Embassy for our reception this afternoon. There will be a bus parked out on Pennsylvania Avenue that will take us up the street to the embassy. So there'll be a few of us that can help direct you out through the mall. With that, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. James Young. He's a special advisor to the Deputy Minister of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, Canada. Dr. Young has held prominent positions during numerous national and international disasters and emergencies. This led to his current appointment as Special Advisor to the Deputy Minister of Public Safety and Special Advisor to and Senior Advisor on Emergency Management for the Department, Portfolio, and other federal departments. In this capacity, Dr. Young provides advice to the Government of Canada, promoting a seamless national emergency management system. As Special Advisor to the Deputy Minister, Dr. Young sees his role as helping to shape a culture of emergency management in Canada that cuts across all levels of government, and which involves the private sector, social agencies, and the citizens they serve. Dr. Young, it is now my pleasure to turn the forum over to you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. It's indeed a pleasure to be invited to moderate this. I feel a bit like a referee, that I'm probably the least qualified and know the least about the topic in the room. That probably allows me to referee in the fairest manner possible. In case anyone's thinking of breaking the rules, my background is in forensic medicine, and I'm known by my friends as Dr. Death, so please stick to your time. I know the ways of disguising it well. So we have a great panel to begin, and from both private sector, from government. As with most people in the field of both security and emergency management these days, we all started somewhere else, and we all have brought to it a variety of experience. We have specialists within the panel, and I think this will serve us well for our discussion later in the afternoon. I'm going to make my introductions quite brief of everyone because we have so much to accomplish during a short time. So I'm going to begin with the gentleman to my right, Thomas Donano, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Infrastructure Protection in the Department of Homeland Security. And this is certainly within the energy industry an important area of infrastructure protection and what's being done. He also, before that, served as Special Assistant to the Chief of Staff in the White House, and so he's transitioned from the White House office into Homeland Security at obviously a very vital time. I note that as well, though, that he was in the private sector for 5 years, so brings private sector experience and a host of degrees to his role. Tom?
Thank you, Dr. Death. Thanks for hosting us here today to Woodrow Wilson Institute. This is, I see some familiar faces around the room, which I think is a good sign of some of the progress that the department's made, both on the international side as well as the private sector side, as well as inside the government. That when it comes to energy issues, that our hand-in-hand partner is the Department of Energy. And that both at the operational level as well as the senior leadership levels, we work very, very closely on all policy issues, as well as most recently we did a cross-border joint operational assessment in Mexico at the Gulf of Campeche, as well as down in Juarez. So we have done some significant work since we stood up the department, since the President signed out HSPD 7. Which is essentially our constitution, if you would, in the critical infrastructure protection world, post PDD 63, for those of you that have been at this for a while. So this is it's a really encouraging sign that when I worked for Governor Ridge in the White House, that a lot of what we're starting to see, I think, as far as partnership, as well as some of the operational interfaces were really, I don't want to say a dream, but they were certainly a treaty, if you would. We had the 30-point plan. We had the initial interface where we sent senior level delegations to Canada, as well as Mexico, understanding that the continent is the economic backbone of our way of life, was certainly threatened by 9/11. And the security paradigm, the economic paradigm, had to be much more closely aligned. And in fact, when they passed the Homeland Security Act of 2002, there was very, very specific reference made to the fact that any security programs or policies or undertakings of this new department would be done with the understanding that we must preserve efficient and secure commerce across the border. That includes both the northern and southern border. And that's a very, very important framework from which we approach this thing called Homeland Security. So thanks to our partners in both the industry and government, both federal and Canadian and Mexican governments, for their support. Just very briefly, I want to talk a little bit about a very important policy initiative that, again, the Homeland Security Act gave the department the authority to exempt public-private partnerships from this thing called FACA. And those of you may be familiar with it, the sort of government gobbledygook of disclosure and public discourse with the private sector. The Congress certainly understood that to have a true public-private partnership, the breadth and scope that I believe the President and both Secretary Chertoff and Ridge envisioned, that we would have to exercise the authority that the Congress gave us in the Homeland Security Act to exempt the operational interface, the public-private partnership, from this thing called FACA. And if you ever worked on a FACA committee, and they're great, they are tremendously staff-intensive. Presidential Directive 7 identified 17 sectors of the United States economy. So each of those had a FACA, some of which do actually, the NSTAC, the telecommunications. You're talking about extremely onerous staff and support function to build this unprecedented partnership that PD7 called for. Just this spring, Secretary Chertoff exercised that exemption and created the Critical Infrastructure Protection Advisory Council, CPAC, more acronyms. But this was sort of inside government gobbledygook bureaucracy, a very, very significant step in the type of partnerships that we talk about at forums like this, but which, when it comes down to it, are what facilitate the operational interface on the ground. Joint assessments, Mexican, American, Canadian teams together assessing what is the infrastructure, what is critical in it, where are the critical nodes, and understanding all of the other issues that come along with asking some of these questions. So by the Secretary exercising that authority gives the department a very, very broad authority now to engage in a very deep dive into this CPAC, this Critical Infrastructure Partnership Protection Advisory Council. And it is very robust. It is very active in the energy sector. We have a full-time specialist on our staff, full-time job, Bill Cummings at the end of the table here, who works energy issues day to day with both the private sector as well as with our partners in the Department of Energy and Industry. So this is very, very significant policy development in the world of Homeland Security that I know one that we're very proud of. And certainly the visionary leadership of both the President and the Secretary to understand if we're going to be serious about what we're doing here today, that it's more about forums and it's a lot more about creating the environment, the legal environment, and the policy framework to execute this important mission. So that's a very, very important engagement. I want to talk a little bit about Hurricane Katrina and what changed, or what the government inside DHS, some of the things that we changed to support the Department of Energy in their traditional role as ESF 12, the energy response leadership. After Hurricane Katrina, some questions that may seem obvious became very apparent as we began to look at the infrastructure, not only the impact area, but those infrastructures and the cascading infrastructure as to what is not only critical to the impact area, but what is thus critical to the nation. So some very, again, what would seem obvious questions of, well, where do we begin to turn on first, or what are the cascading impacts across the nation? This was a WMD effect, natural disaster, where, frankly, unprecedented in scale in the United States. And certainly stressed the ability of governments at both state, local, and municipal levels to provide essential services. So very quickly the question became, where are the critical nodes inside the energy system, if you would, not only electricity, but petroleum. From the security side of the house, for example, we very quickly began to think about Valdez, Alaska. Now that the energy infrastructure in the Gulf had been so incapacitated in such a way that certain critical nodes, if you would, inside the supply chain became extra critical, as now the single point of failure to perhaps national, further national catastrophe, being able to supply product to customers and across borders. So very quickly these national impacts became very evident. These issues were not only asked at the impact area, but also at the national level. So we worked very diligently after the event to say rework, but to edit the existing planning guidance to build in what we call a national infrastructure look to support local restoration. Essentially, what there was no single point of access for that question what is nationally critical, what is now impacted as a result of this WME effect in the Gulf. That question fell to us at DHS as the incident manager under HSP 5, as well as to ESF 12 in the Department of Energy. So we again had to work in partnership to solve this question. One of the major structural changes, tinkering with the boxes, but it's very important, is that the department created a senior position inside the principal federal official cell who will singly be responsible for infrastructure issues. Again, that's not in the operational inside the impact area at the national level in the Joint Field Office, in the principal federal official's office, in his suite, if you would. There'll be a senior official, senior DHS official, who belongs to the PFO, if you would, who's responsible for these national level issues of adjudicating them, receiving input from the private sector where it's appropriate, receiving input from the national level where it's appropriate, or international for that matter, and being able to funnel requests for assistance, general information, down to the appropriate touch point inside the disaster area. So by creating this infrastructure liaison position, it's a very, very significant development in understanding that when we have the sort of national or an international type of event, that we need to think broader, and it needs to be at a higher level. So that's very important. We've done a tremendous amount of work inside our directorate to build the capacity to put analytic teams on the ground, to support ESF 12 as they turn the lights back on, if you would, to support the industry and, for example, certain pumping stations we need to provide fuel to, so that we could, again, the interdependency issue becomes very, very prevalent when you start to shut off major, massive refining capacity in the impact area. So it was a very hard lesson for us. I think working on the fly, we did a darn good job. There were a lot of, in some instances, heroic efforts in Katrina, despite some failures, and we know that. And again, the government moved. The administration moved to correct some of those deficiencies, and we did all of that in partnership with both the industry and with our partners in federal government at DOE and NERC and whatnot. So those are some significant policy developments that are timely, I believe. And the last thing I just wanted to touch on is this, again, sort of, you might get lost in sort of the day-to-day crunching of running programs, but this thing called the National Infrastructure Protection Plan. Presidential Directive 7 told the Secretary and my boss and me, you guys have to go out and write the strategic plan. Of course, one of our goals was to not create a government plan that sat on the shelf that was of no value to those owners and operators who actually own and operate the energy infrastructure, or any infrastructure for that matter. This is the reality and the challenge we're faced with. We have since published, and I hope you all have had a chance to look at this base plan of National Infrastructure Protection Plan, published, I think, in June. We're proud of it. It represents a tremendous collaborative effort on behalf of, again, the private sector and the feds to work a common framework into how are we going to address this problem of what is critical, what are we going to do about it, how do we budget for it, down into some of the program nitty-gritty of executing this plan. This vision, if you would, of Presidential Directive 7. Two important distinctions for this audience here today, or two developments. One is there's an international annex to the NIPP that is full-time staffed and managed inside our office. Our staff person's here today who manages that effort. Understanding that it is a full-time job, understanding and managing the interdependencies, cross-border energy and other infrastructure issues, telecommunications, whatnot, certainly on the continent as well as across the oceans. So that's a very important development. We worked hard with the State Department to build a framework we think would work. Building a plan of this complexity with all the federal agencies, all the private sector entities and equities, extremely complicated. It's a real testament, I think, to the department's partnership model to execute this plan. So the international annex is very, very significant. The other thing that's very significant, if you would, is each, and it sounds a little bit bureaucratic, but I think it's important, each sector has to have its own sector-specific plan attached to the base plan. What's important here is that it recognizes that obviously the heavily physical infrastructure type commercial nuclear power plants, how you approach and think about that sector is drastically different from the cyber and telecommunications sectors, highly distributive, highly networked, in some cases virtual. Very, very different security paradigm. So each sector will have a sector-specific plan. Each one of those plans has to have the same attention to detail and program that went into the base plan. What's important on the sector-specific plan is that the industry has to be at the table when we're drafting the document. This is, again, the power of this CPAC, this FACA exemption that I referred to earlier. And that's a little different from, I think, a government type of interaction where the government writes the plan and they say, well, okay, hey, what do you guys think? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it... if that happens, that in the past I think was generally received as a good thing. This is even pushing that further down the road to say that we want you at the table to help us draft the plan. You own the infrastructure, we don't. In some cases it may be regulated, in some cases it will not. Again, depending on what sector. Commercial news, highly regulated, needless to say. Commercial services, malls, office buildings, and this sort of thing. Another sector, not regulated at all. So we had to build the environment to put the people at the table to help us write the plan. That sector-specific plan is due, I'm sure Ken knows, at the end of the table at DOE at the end of the year, 12/31/06. That sector-specific plan is due to the department and to the president. And that will represent a collaborative effort on how the U.S. government and the owners and operators of the infrastructure intend on moving the security paradigm down the road. And those are very, very significant efforts in my world, in our world, that are very timely. So those are, I just want to give you a quick, I hope I don't go on too long, overview of some of these big issues, and I look forward to having a dialogue and questions and concerns and talk about the issues that are on your mind. And again, thanks for having us here.
Thanks very much, Tom. You raised a number of issues and just avoided the hook. So
Good. I felt it coming.
I'm going to speak next on behalf of the Canadian government, and Bill Elliott, the Associate Deputy Minister for Public Safety in Canada, was intending to give many of these remarks. What I'm going to try to do is mix a few of my own observations in with that as well. Certainly, I think my early slides will state the obvious to everyone in this room, that we enjoy a unique perspective in North America, particularly between Canada and the United States. We shared much more than a border, and we have very unique relationships. We also have challenges, though, and I think Tom raises the point very carefully that one of the great challenges is how do we communicate, and how do we communicate differently than we have in the past? How do we communicate both within governments and between governments, but how do we communicate between governments and private industry? And that's a much different paradigm than we're used to addressing. I think the energy sector, in our view, is one of the more advanced groups, along with communication, telecommunications, etc. But I think we would characterize it right now as much progress, but still much work to do. The next few slides, as I say, are not particularly new or different, but they will make some of the points. And again, Tom mentioned the importance of trade and the importance of everything we do in regards to security and emergency management being linked into the economy as well. And certainly my own experience, when 9/11 happened, the immediate priorities in Ontario, where I was situated at the time, in charge of managing emergencies, the first questions were the safety and security of our citizens. Once we had established, in fact, that there was very little additional threat, all the planes were accounted for, and the events seemed to be have transpired that were going to transpire that day. The next immediate priority immediately became, what do we do about the border? How do we first look after the people that are trapped there, but over the next few days, how do we get the border open? How do we get the flow of goods and services flowing again? We really do operate between our countries with an integrated economy. We have the NAFTA trade agreement, but that really has resulted in essentially integrated economies. And we certainly came to realize the importance of infrastructure such as bridges and roads. The Ambassador Bridge alone is the largest crossing point between two countries anywhere in the world in terms of goods and services traded. I believe the figure is somewhere in the order of $500 million per day flows over that border. And if one takes, for example, the average automobile in North America, parts of that automobile have crossed that border at least 5 times during the manufacture of the vehicle. So we really are quite integrated, and our approaches have to recognize that. I find it startling as well that close to 1 billion people travel back and forth between Canada and the United States in a year. I'm quite aware of it when I arrive at the airport on Monday morning trying to come to the States, but it's amazing that we do as well as we do. The energy system, of course, has important north-south linkages and is a great example of our interconnectivity. Whether we're talking about energy production or oil transfer, natural gas, and the next slides show some of that interconnectivity. We supply, as many of you are aware, 16% of U.S. Oil needs, and in fact are the largest country that sells to the United States outside of the United States. Currently, our reserves in Canada are felt to be in the range of 179,000 billion barrels of oil, and that places us on a par of countries like Saudi Arabia. Much of it is a little more expensive, a little harder to get out from the oil sands, but certainly in the future, we're talking about pipeline and construction and increased trade between our countries, not less. The natural gas networks, of course, are important, and again, as an observer, I read almost every week in the financial sections about new pipelines being contemplated or in fact being started, and Canada is providing 85% of U.S. Natural gas imports. I certainly learned the importance of the grid firsthand, because I had the role of managing the power outage in Ontario after the events in the summer of 2003. Ontario is 50% reliant on nuclear energy, which meant that our system self-poisoned, and it took us a week to 10 days to fully restore power, and we had to then rely on being able to import as much power as we could from New York and Pennsylvania and from other U.S. states as their systems return faster than ours, and we trade that electricity on a daily basis in both directions. A good deal of the New England states import power from Quebec. Ontario, New York, Pennsylvania trade on a regular basis. So what's on the Canadian government's mind these days? What are we thinking and what are we doing? Well, we certainly understand the benefits of being interconnected and support those benefits. But we also, as events in North America and around the world have shown us, we have our vulnerabilities as well. Certainly one of those vulnerabilities includes the risk of infection and the effect of infection with emerging diseases such as SARS and the pandemic that we're currently preparing for. A pandemic, and SARS would have easily been a pandemic, but it turned out to be an infection that did well in the hospital environment and could not sustain itself in the community. Otherwise, it would have spread and it would have been worldwide, but we managed to capture it and stop it in the hospitals in Toronto and in Singapore and Vietnam, Beijing and Hong Kong. But it is a reminder to us that infection doesn't know borders and won't know borders, and certainly if and when we have a pandemic, and it's really a question of when, not whether, and a question of how serious, it will have effects on the energy sector just as it will every other sector. We learned, of course, in the power blackout that interconnectivity can have its downsides and its vulnerability. And certainly I served on the Canada-US Task Force, and one of the lessons to me out of that is that we're all only as good as our weakest link. And when we're involved in being interconnected, we have to ensure, in fact, that the rules are consistent and the rules are being followed. And that brings about the debate of what should be a guideline and what should be a law, and that certainly was one of the debates in that encounter. And in the work we did after the blackout, we learned the importance of paying attention to cyber as we never have before. The cyber systems were set up to ensure the consistency and the reliability of the systems, but they weren't necessarily established at a time when we were worried about security to the degree we are now. And certainly that task force looked at that, and I sat on that panel that looked at that as well, and we recognized that we had to beef up not only the physical security of the energy system, but the cyber security as well. And we personally experienced the risk of that because we were managing the power blackout when the blaster virus came through and in fact paralyzed our computers, including our operations center in Ontario. So we learned firsthand that not only when one thing goes wrong will a second thing go wrong at the same time, but also that we had to be prepared to deal with cybersecurity. There are those that would argue that the solution to interconnectivity is to decouple. We do not believe that is. We don't think it's feasible. We're not suggesting that for a second. We had that debate following the blackout, but do not believe that that's in fact a viable alternative. Preparedness is an evolving concept, and it's an evergreen concept. We had become very complacent at times in Canada about preparedness. We had plans, we thought we had them nicely tucked on the shelf. Few of us ever read them. We've certainly, since 9/11 and the events since then, have recognized that the plans are not vital enough, but they also have to be constantly rewritten and constantly reconsidered. And certainly in an area like critical infrastructure, that's especially true. As new infrastructure is built, other infrastructure is discarded, it becomes increasingly important to constantly be looking at what effects that would have. We also believe that one of the things that the plans didn't do very well is to integrate. And we find, certainly I've been 25 years in government, and one thing I learned in government is that government does silos very well. Unfortunately, when you're managing emergencies and you're doing planning, silos don't work, and you can't manage an event if you're in a silo. So we're doing a lot of work, in fact, to try to break down silos within our governments, whether they be provincial or whether they be federal or municipal, but also then to break down the silos between governments. And we certainly understand the need for there to be one voice with all governments playing part in that voice when events happen. But we also have very much come to understand the important role then between government and industry, and our need to plan with industry and to be integrated with industry when events happen. And certainly we had a severe ice storm in 1998 in Ontario where we lost a lot of critical infrastructure. We lost over 10,000 hydro poles and several hundred of towers right in the middle of winter. We learned to rebuild that, and we learned to work with private industry there. By the time we got to the power blackout, we had the energy people right in the operations center and sitting with the premier and with the cabinet of the province, helping to make the decisions and provide the expertise in the room at the time. We forgot about differences, government and non-government, and it worked extremely well. As I've mentioned, we learned, all of us learned a lot from 9/11, and it's a sad way to have to face some of the risks and the issues that we do, but we would be wrong if we didn't learn from these. We saw some examples of good communication between governments, and getting the aircraft down and getting them on the ground and accounting for them is a good example of two countries, in fact multiple countries, because many of the planes were on their way from Europe, and they were either sent back to Europe or they were landed in general in Canada. So we have learned, and we are learning from these experiences, but we believe there is still much work to do. The direction that we're going, then, we have been working on things like the Smart Border Action Plan since 9/11. And interestingly enough, on my way down here today, John Manley, who is the Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, was on the same plane. He was one of the main architects of that plan, and it was the best example I had seen in many years of two governments not only working together, but actually getting things done and scraping away all of the reasons why we couldn't do it, and in fact saying we must do this and getting it done in rapid order. And I think it's a real model for us to continue our work. As well, Tom already alluded to the North American Security and Prosperity Partnership. It's a partnership that involves Canada, the United States, and Mexico. There are a broad number of issues that are being studied under this, and our government is very supportive of that. One of the issues that is being studied under it that I'm very aware of, and the work that's going to be very important, includes pandemic planning. And with the way we work in today's environment with communications crossing over the borders, it's important that the messages in an emergency that Canadians get are similar in nature to what the Americans get. There we go. We too are working on our critical infrastructure protection plan. We're taking an all hazards approach. Tom has mentioned that the U.S. Plan has been released. Ours is well along the way, but under development. This is an area that I would say I've done, again, quite a bit of work in the last couple of years on this, and this has proven to be a much more difficult task than we originally thought. It's not nearly as simple when you recognize that 80 or 85% of the infrastructure is in private hands. We're very aware of the need for for proprietary information to be protected, we recognize that we have to establish different ways of communicating. So that has taken us longer. We've decided it's better to do a little slower and try to get it right, but our plan 2 will be coming out very soon. The plan in Canada will likely, in typical Canadian manner, some things in Canada will probably be slightly different than some things in the United States. We're likely to be less prescriptive in terms of our approach with industry. We're likely to set guidelines more than we are to say that to order that things are done. We're much less likely to actually approve the plans ourselves, so much as to say you're responsible for writing a plan that, and we're much less likely to actually keep the information at hand, so much as to say, give us the information when we need it. We're quite worried about trying to keep the evergreening if we're keeping all the plans on all of the sectors, but our plan certainly is underway, and we're wrestling with all of these issues currently. There is a Canada-U.S. energy group that are studying these issues. They're working on the assessment of the risk and where we need to put our efforts currently. And they're at the point of gathering information, exchanging information, providing baseline data. But clearly it's an area, as Tom indicated, that there's much work to do. Oh, okay. No, it's fine. Essentially, we believe that it is good business for the government and business to be working together. We think the population expects it, and we intend to work very vigorously in these areas. So, those would be both my comments and those of Bill Elliott. I hope I represent what he would have said. Otherwise, I'm out of job next week. My next pleasure is to introduce our next speaker. As soon as I find my notes. There we are. And the next speaker is Michael Armstrong. Michael is the Vice President of Emergency Management and Homeland Security for ICF International. I note that Michael's involved right now in 3 really very diverse but very interesting projects. He's involved with the U.S. Department of Justice regarding the victims of terrorism. He's involved with the U.S. Food and Drug Administration regarding contingency planning for mad cow disease. And he's involved with the U.S. Department of Defense regarding demonstrating the capacities of a common web portal for first responders' internet applications. He's an expert on mitigation, and so he brings that important dimension to the discussion as well. And he's a former member of FEMA. Michael?
Okay. Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be invited to participate in this forum today. I'm recalling that back in the 1990s, when I was working at FEMA and dealing what was, I don't know if it's still referred to as Emergency Preparedness Canada, or if that whole moniker has changed or not, and going across the border and talking with officials there about building disaster-resistant communities. And in those days, we certainly were in the pre-9/11 era, but what impressed me there was how quickly the Canadians were bringing the private sector to the table at the front end of policy creation, and how sometimes I think here in the U.S., at least historically, we've lagged behind on the necessity of having private sector up and front and center in the discussion. And I underline what Tom said earlier about the importance of participation in every phase of emergency management, of having a desk in the Emergency Operations Center, of being a participant in exercises. And I think that there's a lot yet to be learned about the expectations of the private sector of the public sector, as well as the expectations of the public sector. And what I want to do in my allotted time here today is perhaps explore those expectations and those assumptions and how they sometimes collide with each other and or complement each other, and just maybe set up the framework for the discussion we're going to have later about what is and isn't working, and the role of a public-private partnership and how it can insert itself into that and try to be a problem solver. Let's see, do I have a clicker here? Great, thank you. And I'm going to actually click ahead.
just pointed at that.
Any arrow works? There we go. We're talking about here today security, and security is in the eye of the beholder, I suppose, but I think it's important to underline, again, as Tom said earlier, that especially in the post-Katrina environment, let's not forget about the role of infrastructure in natural disasters as well as human-caused disasters. And we're talking about physical assets as well as cyber assets. And this cyber asset piece has been, for many people, a difficult one to get their hands around. The term public-private partnership has almost become a cliche, I would argue. In the past decade, it was thrown around a lot 5 to 10 years ago as the panacea for all issues. I think the value of the term has somewhat been diluted over the years, and it's easy to insert it into a speech or into a policy document or to give it a slight reference when you're trying to show that you know that people should be talking to each other. But in reality, a public-private partnership does have some key elements to it. And it's a voluntary relationship. You cannot mandate a partnership. You cannot legally require people to partner with each other. You can require meetings to occur. You can require reports to be given. But you cannot legally mandate a partnership. It is voluntary in nature. Secondly, there has to be a real commitment. For a public-private partnership to have value, it can't just be business as usual. Somebody convenes a meeting, everybody talks about common interests, everyone agrees that was a good meeting, and then a year later they have another meeting. That's not a public-private partnership. Also, there has to be value that is created, that the relationship itself creates something new that did not exist before. Again, sometimes what I've seen both in when I was in government as well as now as a consultant for public and private sector clients is that just reiterating what already exists does not create new value. So the public-private partnership should create something new. And finally, there should be a measurement of progress towards goals. There's 3 key words: measurement, progress, and goals. And again, sometimes we spend a lot of time spinning around each other about nodding in agreement that we have the same problems that we had 2 and 3 years ago. There's no measurement, there's no progress, and there's no goals. So I'd like to just explore 4 key concepts here from our perspective as consultants. And when we were asked to speak here, I quickly made sure that a couple of my colleagues came with me to this forum. Phil Milmester, who's over here, go ahead and raise your hand, Phil, runs our energy group and actually is helping support the creation of the sector-specific plan for energy for Tom and Assistant Secretary Stefan, and also has a number of private sector clients in the energy industry. So he has a sense of where perhaps both folks are coming from. Bob Quarton, right here, is also supporting an initiative for Assistant Secretary Stefan on how public-private partnerships might be effective in the environment of critical infrastructure protection. And so I'm going to, at some point, defer to them as we get into the dialogue today about the specific technicalities there. But I'm summarizing what I call public sector expectations and skepticism as an orientation that is be strategic and demonstrate progress. That's, if you want to attach a personality trait to the public sector and how it views this issue, that could be a personality trait. Similarly, from the private sector, their expectations, their skepticism, they want to take, in the context of critical infrastructure protection, confidential action driven by threat and warning. That's the personality trait that we have seen working with our clients that comes from the private sector. There are approaches that are being taken currently and that are proposed that start with collaborative steps that identify a common interest and identify what the clear roles are. And finally, the challenges for the future I would sum up as the trust vulnerability conundrum. And I'll talk about that for a few moments and see if I'm hitting any familiar themes here. Regarding the public sector, as Tom mentioned, Homeland Security Presidential Directive 7 was issued by President Bush to address this issue of critical infrastructure protection and create an expectation of the executive branch of government that something would be manifested in terms of public policy that would assure the American public and show accountability to the Congress that, yes, the federal government is doing something to organize our nation around a strategy. And government feels, again, genetically wired, that that's its responsibility as public servants, that they are charged with coming up with public policy that demonstrates to its citizenry that they are protecting the welfare of the nation. The National Infrastructure Protection Plan, as Tom mentioned, it creates a strategic framework for common approaches across all sectors, and it also creates the basis for a dialogue between the public and the private sector about how we would get from identifying assets all the way through creating protective measures and designing metrics to discuss success. And that is, again, a public sector piece of evidence, if you will, regarding its expectation. Now, the United States Congress has, as its purview, from time to time been very vocal about what should be happening, what is happening, and what isn't happening. You've probably, a lot of you, read the newspaper reports about the National Asset Database and why is a miniature golf course on there as opposed to this nuclear power plant, and so on and so forth. There's a congressional expectation that something is happening, that there's a list that they can point to. And my experience in working in the federal government and dealing with the Congress is that you have to deal with what I call the pothole mentality. Find the pothole, fill the pothole, take the photograph of the congressman next to the pothole. And so there's pressure upon the executive branch on the part of the appropriators and the rule makers for the executive branch to design a pothole program around all federal public policy, including critical infrastructure protection. And so there's this constant tension between the legislative branch regarding what have you done for me lately, executive branch regarding this list, this prioritization, where you're spending the money, and the evidence that you're filling the potholes, and the efforts of the executive branch to have an effective dialogue with the private sector that avoids overregulation, alienation, and encouraging further distrust beyond what already exists between the public and private sector. So you can see, even though there is a public sector set of expectations and skepticism, they don't always emanate from the same source or come up with the same result. There are editorial opinions that are also part of the public sector genetic map in terms of what people across the country think should be happening with critical infrastructure protection as it affects jobs, as it affects health and safety. Where is the role of state government? Where is the role of local government? How much is the government going to take care of? What is our responsibility at the local level? Then there's this whole issue of trust in the private sector by the public. How much does the public really trust the private sector to just take care of it on their own without some sort of mandate, without some sort of regulation, without some sort of reporting requirement? This push and pull we have, whether it's laissez-faire economics or some other issue regarding how do you empower the private sector to do what it does best and at the same time demonstrate to the public a sense of safety. And also the public isn't so trustful in the government either. Just because my government has produced a list, is it real? Are these assets really being addressed? Is this strategy really being implemented? Or is it just another report, as someone said earlier, that's sitting on the shelf? And finally, what's the reading on the risk-o-meter this morning? What's the issue that's driving me to write the editorial or pass the legislation or make the speech? So these are things that, in terms of the genetic makeup of the public sector, that I think is important, what we hear as consultants, for the private sector to understand going into this public-private partnership possibility. That's the orientation that you're running into. Now, from the private sector side, we have seen, in working with our private sector clients and also working on the NIPP and on the sector-specific plan process, that the private sector sees the government role as primarily one that's informational. We want information from the government. We don't want prescription. We don't want a lot of direction. We don't want a lot of boxes to check. We want information. The job of government is to gather intelligence, to use its police power and its national security authority effectively to inform us. So the orientation of the private sector is viewing government as an information source. It also views the government as having a disaster prevention responsibility, anti-terrorism efforts, weather monitoring, etc. That's a natural role of the public sector. But again, that leads back to information. And then also response and recovery and restoration. That's also a government role that the private sector expects to see occurring that is helpful to its ability to manage its infrastructure. Therefore, there's a resistance to regulation of critical infrastructure protection. We have seen here in the U.S. No, you can leave it on the same slide. I'm just going to linger on that slide.
I thought you were here.
No. That's okay. Pre-9/11 and in the 1990s, critical infrastructure protection in the U.S. was largely housed in the Department of Energy. That's where it was. And even today, the roots of what occurs in the infrastructure protection part of the Preparedness Directorate at DHS comes from the Department of Energy. And we have seen probably in working with all the sector-specific plans that the energy plan is probably one of the more robust plans. It's probably farther along. There's been dialogue for a good decade in the energy sector about critical infrastructure protection. Some parts are already heavily regulated, such as the nuclear power industry, but others are not. But there's a general resistance to regulation as the solution, as the public policy solution. Getting back to the public expectation that we're going to have a list, we're going to have priorities, we're going to spend money, you're going to tell us what's safer than it was yesterday. The methodology to get there on the part of the private sector is not regulation. There's also a concern about sharing information with the government. Now, there are efforts underway to assure the private sector that when information is necessary to the process, that it will be protected. And some folks are testing that out, Tom, and some believe it's going to happen, and others are kind of saying, well, I'm not so sure. There's a concern that the information is going to fall into the hands of competitors. We find that our private sector clients are more concerned about their competitors than they are about the terrorists in terms of where the information goes. But they are also concerned about the wrong people getting the information. They're also concerned about the wall that needs to exist between the regulatory arm of the government and other arms of the government. They're also concerned about public pressure groups and how that might impact various industries. And also, this whole issue we've seen recently about security within federal government agencies around computers and other material. The current approach so far with public-private partnerships has been to convene and facilitate sector-specific discussions, promote common terms and training tools, supply a general strategic approach, provide grant support, on-site support to provide vulnerability assessments, comprehensive reviews. But again, this issue of identifying assets, how is that done? It enables government to set priorities, but it requires a lot of data from the private sector. The industry, its approach is to establish best practices and measurement tools via a consensus process. Industry organizations are doing this in sort of a self-policing fashion. Certifying success is something that we've heard from industry-oriented groups. Let us certify the success within our industry and then deliver it back to the government. We don't need the government doing that. Using an event-specific approach. Give us the information, and based on the type of event it is, where the event is located, the part of the energy infrastructure that's impacted, then we will do what we need to do to protect the critical infrastructure. Because it varies depending on the event. One size does not fit all in critical infrastructure protection. A potential future approach. There are structured public-private partnerships in other policy areas such as greenhouse gas reduction, workplace health and safety. You will need, if you're going to have an effective public-private partnership, we think you'll need to balance public expectations versus private concerns. There are going to be issues around performance and reporting standards, issues around data security, of the ability to demonstrate to the public at large due diligence that something is really happening, and that there is real trust on both sides. So finally, I think that the challenges that exist before us are, on the one hand, this idea that we want to itemize and prioritize versus let events drive action, let threats drive action. Information security, and the nuances within the sector itself. There are many subsectors within a sector that have additional issues that can't be fully addressed and, in fact, perhaps not effectively impacted by a one-size-fits-all approach. There is an example here. If you want to look at the chemical sector versus the electric sector, in this case, both have standards that they're approaching. The American Chemistry Council has established responsible care standards. NERC has established electric reliability standards. These ACC standards affirm existing large company practices, however. They're not as easy to meet on the part of smaller companies in the private sector. NERC standards, on the other hand, while they exist, they probably have less teeth than the ACC standards. And again, subsectors prevent singular approach across the sector. So there is an example, but it's not always an applicable example out there. Just to wrap up, to let you know a little bit about our bias and where we're coming from at ICF. Again, we're supporting the Assistant Secretary at DHS on the NIP, on the energy sector specific plan, and on public-private partnerships. And take that little block off there. We also developed a critical infrastructure plan for Metropolitan Seattle. One of our partners there, Matt Morrison, is going to speak tomorrow from Penwar. We're also doing a lot of ongoing support for private clients and public energy clients, including utilities and federal regulatory agencies. And we've done a lot of work in public-private partnerships. And again, Bob and I and Phil are all here today. We enjoy having conversations on this topic, and we look forward to talking to you further.
Thanks very much, Michael. You clearly got your government out of your system when you're able to talk about pothole mentality. Very healthy. Our next speaker is Patrick Currier, who's an associate with the law firm Van Ness Feldman. Patrick pointed out to me that he doesn't have as much white hair as the rest of us. That's good, because we need some people following up. These are long-term projects, and some of us are going to be rocking soon enough in nursing homes, so we need the young, bright people like Patrick. Patrick's expertise is in security issues, and he works on the regulatory needs of clients with regards to a number of acts, including the Public Utility Holding Company Act, the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act, and the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, and the Energy Policy Act. It all sounds very exciting. He's been a law clerk and worked his way as a judicial intern, and clearly has for his age, a very impressive CV at this point, and so really very much is an up-and-comer. So, Patrick, we'd like to hear your views.
I am actually speaking on behalf of a partner who was invited today, Jay Ryan, and I was glad to hear that he recommended me to speak and that I was allowed to still come even when we found out that he wasn't going to be able to participate. And I want to thank the Wilson Center for allowing our firm, Van Ness Feldman, to be a part of this forum today. Part of my job as an energy attorney in the energy sector is to ensure that our clients are compliant with the various regulatory schemes that the state and federal governments are creating, and where the laws are clearly the laws and the rules are clearly defined. It makes my job kind of go much smoother. But problems tend to arise when there's ambiguity in the law, or where the roles of the private and public sectors they're not so clear. They're undefined. This confusion creates regulatory gaps, and where there are gaps, our energy infrastructure becomes less reliable and more vulnerable. For instance, after 9/11 and the 2003 blackout, and to an extent Katrina and Rita, many people expected, myself included, a flurry of legislative and regulatory activity to come out of Congress, DOE, FERC, and the Department of Homeland Security. Clients were coming to us and they still come to us, and they want to know what they need to do in order to remain in compliance with the law. But for a large part, to a large extent, we have to tell them, and some of them are surprised to hear, that with the exception of the Energy Policy Act of 2005, there really hasn't been a lot of legislation for mandatory regulatory obligations. And thus it's been 5 years since 9/11 and 3 years since the 2003 blackouts, and without any mandatory requirements. And so this void has created a sort of regulatory gap. And it's created uneasiness and a bit of uncertainty amongst some of our private sector clients. And one client described it as being in a sort of regulatory limbo in which they're not sure of which direction to take. And so this poses questions such as what are other companies doing? Should I do something on our own? Or should we wait and do nothing until the government comes out and outlines its own plan? And these questions kind of bring me to a somewhat contentious issue that I raised for debate probably later during the dialogue, and that is, that's instead of this mandatory obligations, we have a kind of private sector volunteerism, and the sort of volunteerism I'm referring to, it comes in two forms. The first is where the government issues guidance establishing a program, laying out its expectations and private sector responsibilities, but it's with the caveat that it's guidance; it's not necessarily required. And so this way, it's just encouraged. The other is industry-driven. And that's where you see a development, uniform, develop an industry-wide or best practices type of standard. And of course, as was mentioned, the push behind this volunteerism is that who's in the best position to police the infrastructure. And that's because 85% of the critical infrastructure in this country, as Jim pointed out, is owned by the private sector. And I think the Department of Homeland Security did a pretty good job of recognizing that there's no way for them to police the miles and miles of transmission lines. And we can really see this, and it's already been hit on so much with the NIP that I'm not going to go into any of the technical aspects of that, but I really want to emphasize that the protection plan, the National Infrastructure Protection Plan is not mandatory, but rather seeks to improve coordination through voluntary security partnerships between government agencies and private sector critical asset owners. In contrast to the interim NIP, there's actually the final NIP actually provides private industry with significant input opportunities, particularly with respect to the development of sector-specific plans, which we've been talking about, and the creation of sector coordinating councils that work with government coordinating councils. These councils then create the structure for which representative groups from all levels of government and private sector can collaborate and share approaches to the physical protection. And as Mike pointed out, there's interest in the information sharing. And again, through a voluntary program, the DHS has established the Protected Critical Infrastructure Information Program. The PCII program encourages the private sector voluntarily submit information, critical asset information, by limiting the use of and dissemination of submitted information. And although the private sector participation in the program is voluntary, there was just a recently issued rule, I think it came out in late September, that makes participation more appealing to the private sector. It simplifies the submission process, it provides additional protections and safeguards for protected information, and it clarifies the permitted use by which for governments that actually have access to that information. And so based on just these two examples, the Department of Homeland Security has developed what I think are pretty thorough and valuable programs that can act at least as benchmarks for the private sector to kind of seek to achieve, and we've seen that to some extent. And so it's going to be really interesting, especially come the end of December and January 1, when we see that these sector-specific plans are supposed to be due. And it'd be nice. It's going to be really interesting to see what those entail and how much involvement from the private sector there really is. Excuse me. Of course, the primary concern of most of our clients is going to be the cost of implementation, and so that's always going to be a question. And switching gears now to industry-initiated programs, a real innovative program just came out just a few weeks ago. The Edison Electric Institute. I don't know. I'm not sure if we have anyone from EEI here today, but they recently put forth a voluntary initiative in which a group of predominantly private sector electric utilities have established what it's kind of technical. It's the Spare Transformer Equipment Program, or STEP, and the purpose of which is to increase the industry's inventory of spare electric transformers to better ensure that the industry has sufficient capability to restore service in the event of a coordinated, deliberate destruction of utility substations. the agreement actually requires each participating utility to sell its spare transformers to any other participating utility that suffers from a triggering event, which for now is just defined more as acts of terrorism, and it's going to be interesting to see if natural disasters is maybe the next logical step. And at present, 43 utilities, primarily most of them are private sector entities, have already signed on to this voluntary agreement. And this is representing more than 60% of the FERC jurisdictional bulk power system. And so this development is really interesting because we have a voluntary contract that's been voluntarily drawn up and voluntarily entered into by private parties, and yet by signing the agreement, these parties are bound to each other and they're required to comply, or else they're going to be in breach of their own created contract. And this kind of goes beyond the normal best practices or industry standards that we're used to seeing. This is actually a binding contract to help ensure reliability of the nation's power grid by limiting prolonged disruptions after an attack. And so again, it's going to be pretty interesting to see if similar industry-driven initiatives are established, and of course, their subsequent level of effectiveness. And it's strange because this development from the electric sector is quite interesting because concurrently in the same sector, the electric sector, we're witnessing an example of where private sector volunteerism, that it's now actually being replaced with mandatory reliability standards because of the private sector's alleged failure to adequately ensure the reliability of the bulk power system, and that's of course because of the blackouts of 2003. Because up to that point, utilities that provided service to FERC's open access transmission tariff, they only needed to provide that they were operating under good utility practice, which FERC had loosely at the time interpreted as compliance with NERC's reliability standards. But the problem with these standards is that they were never mandatory. They were originally developed as voluntary industry standards. And moreover, NERC just had no resources to police whether or not these utilities were complying with the standards, much less did they have the authority to enforce anything on anybody for any sort of or they had no penalty authority. But after the blackout and subsequent investigations by both U.S. and Canadian authorities, it became quite apparent that these transmission utilities, whether knowingly or not, were not properly or fully complying with the NERC voluntary standards. And to remedy this apparent failure, as we all know, is that Congress passed the Energy Policy Act of 2005, Section 1211 of which requires FERC to approve an electric reliability organization, which is going to be responsible for developing mandatory FERC-approved enforceable electric reliability standards. And these are also going to be out hopefully January 1st, 2007, or shortly thereafter. That's the timetable that they're on. And so despite my earlier examples citing the encouraging signs of government-private sector cooperation and industry-driven initiatives, we have here an example where permitting a voluntary industry-driven volunteerism failed, and the federal government felt compelled to step in and require mandatory regulations in order to achieve the desired level of assurance for the national power grid. And so this begs the question of whether private sector volunteerism can be an effective means of assuring the reliability of the North American energy system. And I believe that it can play a successful role, but the question that we're often asked is why? Why would the private sector establish, or most importantly, comply with and adhere to standard costly voluntary programs when there's no government obligation to do so? But simply they want to know, where's my motivation? And there's a few motivators out there, and one of which is the fact that by establishing their own voluntary programs, the private sector, they're allowed to kind of do it on their own terms without having, they can be proactive, and rather than being reactive to a government program and waiting for the government to establish a burdensome program that could saddle them on unnecessary administration and costs. And similarly, failure to comply with or adhere to their own voluntary standards will result in government intervention. We saw this, especially if the incident's big. We saw this in 2003 blackouts. It resulted in now we're going to have mandatory reliability electric standards, and we just saw this again recently with the BP spill in Alaska. Almost immediately after the news broke, there were calls for government oversight and stricter regulatory requirements because apparently the industry wasn't trusted to handle itself. So, and now they're talking about some more regulation. So another important motivator is the fear of significant civil liability. as a reason to adopt these voluntary standards. Under common law principles and basic negligent elements, the courts are going to look to see if there's an industry standard out there. And if there's an incident, and it's realized that the company has failed to use this standard, even though it's voluntary, and that the company's broken no laws or regulations, the court's still likely to find that a duty has been breached. And some courts might even be inclined to find that such complacency reaches the level of gross negligence, which is going to result in higher penalties, exponentially making it, if you go from compensatory damages to possible punitive damages. And I think the government can play also a major role as far as the motivation for the private sector to do some of these voluntary requirements. I mean, and it's going to take some creative ideas, but there's possibly loan guarantees, additional tax incentives, or other creative funding, so that it doesn't have to come out of pocket from the private sector, which has been in usually a part where talks have broken down, at least from what I've seen. And if the government is at least helping to fund this, they at least then still have some limited oversight through the power of the purse, but they're not going to be so hands-on as to over-regulate the industry. The private sector, in turn, will be motivated to voluntarily comply with these programs or establish these programs because they're not going to be bearing the cost on their own, and hopefully they won't have to pass the costs on to the customer, which is also a pretty big issue, a pretty big hurdle for this. And so there appears that there are some sufficient motivations out there for the private sector to get into. But it's going to be interesting to see what the future holds, that's for sure. And in wrapping this up, I think it's my belief that there have been pretty good improved efforts from both sides to bridge this regulatory gap between a lack of regulation versus too much regulation to striking a balance. And that's why I think there is room for improvement, but I don't ever see the gap completely closing. I think a balance of private sector volunteerism and government regulation can play a vital role in assuring the capacity of the North American energy system. But I think it's only going to work if the expectations, responsibilities, requirements, and the roles of both the private and the public sector are clearly defined. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Our final speaker on the panel is Paul McGregor, who's the Vice President of Operations and Engineering Services with TransCanada, who I know is also one of the sponsors of the seminar. So Paul will continue with the private sector approach. He's served in various capacities for a long time with TransCanada. He was rewarded for living in the cold climate of North Bay, Ontario, by being moved to the Chinook country in Boomtown in Calgary, where he now resides. So I'm sure he notices a considerable difference between North Bay and Calgary at times, but he's paying for the privileges because of the Boomtown in Calgary. So, Paul?
Thanks very much, Jim. I'm always appreciative of the fact that I'm the last speaker before the break, and the chair of the panel is Dr. Death. So I'm in good shape. I'm going to talk today about the natural gas transmission system in North America, and really its capability to provide ongoing reliability to delivering an energy source to North America, Canada, the U.S., and so on. I'm going to talk about what we are doing today as a company and what's generally being done in the industry, and also what we see the issues being going forward. I believe personally the grid has a fairly good reliability record today. If it didn't, we'd hear a lot more about it. But going forward, I think there's a lot of challenges in front of us, and I just want to bring a few of those out. But since I'm a corporate sponsor, I have to give you my advertisement on TransCanada, so I'll do that as quickly as I can. TransCanada is one of the leading energy infrastructure companies in North America. We have just over $24 billion in assets, Canadian. We have two core businesses. We're probably more known by our natural gas transmission system that stretches from pretty well coast to coast. But also we're a growing independent energy power producer with a lot of assets in Canada and some in the United States. We have a lot of assets, but we don't necessarily have a lot of people. We have about just less than 2,500 employees, but I'd like to say they are definitely skilled and highly technical in what they do. And finally, what we're also pretty proud of as a company is our strong financial position. We've been working on that quite diligently for the last few years. And we're definitely in a position today to take advantage of opportunities that may come up in both gas and power. Next, please. Next. Just wanted to give you a little closer look at the transmission map for TransCanada. As you can see, the bulk of our assets are in Canada. We move most of the Western Canadian gas production, about 80 to 85% of it is moved in our system. About half of that is moved to markets in Canada, and the other half is moved to markets in the United States, as you can see in the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, and the Northeastern U.S. So it's a fairly large system. We have about 41,000 kilometers of pipe. The other thing I would have you note is the little dotted lines in the north is just our way of saying that we can handle northern gas if it ever actually comes to happen. So that one on the right would be Mackenzie, and the other one on the left would be Alaska. And I should say we have people in our company that have been with us for 30 years, and when they were hired, they started working on the Alaska gas pipeline. And their wish is, before they retire, they'd like to see something happen. Next slide. I showed you the TransCanada grid. Now I'd like to show you the entire North American grid. And Jim showed you a summarized version of this earlier. It's a fairly intensive grid, highly interconnected, developed. Probably the bulk of it's been developed over the last 50 years. The TransCanada system, the spade went in the ground in 1957, so that's when the first piece of pipe started to go in. So essentially 41,000 kilometers have really, our entire system has been developed since that time. But looking at the rest of the grid, the bulk of it has been developed over that last 50-year period. Some of it existed prior to that, but as the acceptance of natural gas as an energy source came on and people started to get comfortable with the idea of gas coming into their homes, and the price was there and it was highly available, it's gone up in demand, and as a result the grid has developed fairly substantially. Now keep that in mind when we talk later about issues of putting pipe in the ground today. If you're talking about development on that scale, that's really what we're looking at in trying to meet the growth of North America. Not just providing a reliable system, but an ongoing system that can meet the demands. Extensive grid, and not surprisingly, natural gas accounts for 20% of all the energy in North America. The delivery system is an integral part of our day-to-day lives. It hits pretty well every city, every town you can think of. In fact, it's quite unusual if somebody doesn't have access to gas for heating, for energy, for power, or whatever. We know the day-to-day impact is pretty big for you, everyone sitting around the table, but the economic impact is actually quite huge as well. It's not only an energy source, but it's a feedstock for a lot of industry too. And as price and reliability become issues, then that can become an issue as well. The bottom line, though, is if this system doesn't work effectively, we all know about it real fast. So why is the system today reliable? And I am going to say it is very reliable. We've been through a lot of challenges over the last number of years, and it's held up, and it delivers the gas. It might cause price changes, but it is reliable. Well, a number of reasons. One is it's very well integrated in terms of companies. We all have our own pipelines. We look after them, but you can't really tell where the gas moves from one company to the other. It's all seamless to everybody at this table. Multiple supply and delivery options. We bring gas in from various basins, and there's more than one way usually to get to one market. It's not just one road into town normally. Storage capability at both ends, supply and market. Now this is really important because when you have disruptions on the system, storage and even the gas in the pipe itself can act as a buffer to disruptions. The storage is obviously used for various reasons, meeting peak demands in the winter, dealing with summer lows in terms of delivery needs. But it also allows you to buffer disruptions to the system. And as a result, you can generally keep a lot of things fairly localized and not spreading through the entire grid and cascading. Most infrastructure is buried and protected. Now, this is an advantage in some cases, and when I get into pipeline integrity later, it may not be such a great advantage, but it being buried, about 80 to 85% of our infrastructure is below ground. So there is an inherent security opportunity there as well. And it's highly distributed. When I look at the grid, you don't really have one weakness in the system. It's so spread around, and you're able to bypass problems fairly easy. There is, as I say, storage and some redundant capacity in the system, that there is no one weakness. If we find one, we can deal with it, but at this point, I think we've been tested enough to know that it is fairly distributed. Having said all that, what are some of the threats to reliability today and on an ongoing basis? Now, system integrity, keeping the system in good shape, natural disasters, not a big surprise, and we've gone through that fairly recently. And finally, willful damage and terrorism, which has now come into our vocabulary over the last 5 to 6 years. Next, please. I'm going to talk to each one in turn now. So let's talk about system integrity. About 80 to 90% of our system is pipeline, buried pipeline. We have compressors and valves and things like that above ground, but the bulk of our system integrity usually focuses around our pipeline system itself, the actual pipe in the ground. The key components to a good system is, and I'm going to use things like risk-based and hazard assessment. This is a way of trying to understand what the real issues are, what the materiality of the issues are, and putting the money to that so you have a better protected system for hopefully a good cost. Continuous monitoring and testing is absolutely critical. We have a control center in Calgary that monitors all the pipe that you saw laid out earlier. And we also have connections to that control center and to other control centers for other companies as well. So we can keep an eye on our system, and we keep updated with other systems. Data collection, testing, electronic and physical inspection are all really required. So we all heard about pigging. I think as a result of the BP incident, pigging actually made the newspaper for a change, which is kind of surprising. But that's one way of testing the pipe from the inside, running a pig through periodically, seeing what the corrosion levels are. We have cathodic protection systems. We actually dig up our pipe periodically and physically and visibly inspect it to make sure it's the way we think it is. And also we do hydrostatic testing periodically, put water in the pipe, pump it up to a pressure higher than maximum operating pressure, and make sure it holds. So we do that all as part of our ongoing process. And finally, a comprehensive public awareness program. I mentioned earlier that pipe being buried is good, but it can also be bad because people forget it's there. They don't recall that it could be dangerous if they start digging into it. It's just out of sight, out of mind. So you need to go out and not only talk to the public at large, but of course the emergency services, the other providers out there, to make sure we know how to deal with the pipe on an ongoing basis. Make sure you know how to manage and operate around it, municipalities, the towns, the cities, and so on. You need to have a fairly comprehensive awareness program to make this all work, and it has to incorporate all of those parties. And you have to do it in a way that people will get the message. And what we find is sending little calendars out really doesn't cut it with a lot of people. You have to find ways of getting the message across. So that is something that's an ongoing challenge as well. Next. Let's talk about natural disasters. Katrina came up earlier, and that's probably burned in everybody's memory. I can recall sitting in Calgary looking at TV and just couldn't believe what I saw unfolding. I can't even imagine what people went through down there. When we look at the pipeline aspects of this, though, there was significant damage to the infrastructure and the underwater side of it in the Gulf. And we saw some interconnections with other companies and connections. We saw some photos and such of damage underwater and pipes being ripped apart basically by wave action or rigs dragging anchors around. There was about 2 to 3 BCF that went offline and a fair amount of damage. Yet, at the end of the day, people got gas. The price definitely spiked. Let's not kid ourselves. There was definitely a response there. But what we found about the system, it was able to adjust. The price and the ability of the gas to flow in different directions meant that generally everybody got the gas they needed to make sure all critical areas were covered. People had the heating, air conditioning, and so on. So I don't think most people would even understand the significance of the damage that occurred to the infrastructure at that time. The other thing I would also point out is through any disaster, actually at any time, there's a high degree of intercompany activity and work going on. I'll call it teamwork to keep the system reliable. It's actually in everybody's best interest in the gas transmission industry to have a reliable industry, to be known that way, to make sure people get the gas when they need it, to make sure there are no disruptions. And the amount of teamwork that goes on behind the scenes is actually quite remarkable. I've experienced it myself when we ourselves had a fairly major line break a number of years ago, it essentially shut down about 80% of our throughput going to Eastern Canada and the U.S. And at that time, a number of companies came to our assistance to help us get the line back in service, but also to utilize their storage capabilities to offset the throughput loss that had happened. Most people would never know what happened, but there is a lot of teamwork that can really pay off. Next. Willful damage and terrorism. And you never want to downplay this side of it, because if somebody wants to cause damage, they can. There are ways of getting at assets. We take some comfort in the fact a lot of our stuff is buried. We do have above ground facilities. 10 to 15% of our stuff would be above ground. But when we look at criminal intent or terrorism, on the criminal side, I'm not quite sure what drives people, but there may be reasons for it. If you're on the terrorism side, I'm not an expert on terrorism, but if you're looking for targets that create a spectacular response or impact, pipes don't necessarily do that. Again, you have to find a way of getting to some real critical areas, and because the system is so distributed and a lot of it buried, it's really hard to do that. And we also can mitigate a lot of impacts, as I've talked about earlier. That being said, I think most companies and all of us have definitely beefed up our security over the last number of years. We've fenced off more than we've done in the past. Intrusion alarms have been installed in most places. Again, we can monitor most of our facilities 24 hours a day. So do not take my comments as trying to downplay the issue. It's just terrorism or willful damage can be treated like a number of other issues, natural disasters and so on, and we just have to deal with it. And we can take precautions, and we are, but we feel the system can handle that kind of response and not have a material impact on its ability to deliver the product. And finally, when there is damage, we do have the capability to repair pipelines fairly quickly. Now, in the Gulf, a lot of the underground stuff took longer, but the bulk of our assets are actually on land and buried, so you can replace a line fairly quickly. And when I say quickly, I'm not saying months, but weeks or even days. So it depends how quickly you can get to the site. Next. So the keys to maintaining a high degree of reliability looking forward, and it's a comment also that Patrick made earlier, is a strong and verifiable maintenance program. We have developed programs over the years, again, risk-based, hazard-assessed programs that we feel are top-notch, and we apply them, and we work with our industry associates to do that. But the one thing you have to do is make sure you can verify you're actually doing the work. It's nice to have this shiny maintenance program you put on your shelf, but you have to make sure it's being applied. And so there's a huge compliance issue here. And a lot of our programs are not necessarily, like there's minimum regulatory standards, and we may go above those in some areas like pipe integrity. But the compliance is a compliance requirement we put on ourselves. So we actually measure our ability to comply with all our maintenance practice and procedures, and it's reported to our board throughout the year. So it's we're not so much worried about the regulators. We understand what the requirements are. We're more worried about ourselves and living up to saying what we're going to do. Greater standardization of regulations. The number of regulations continues to grow, and it may not be economic, it may be environmental based, it may be safety based, it may be security based, but they are growing. And all we would ask is, and I think I heard a bit of that today, let's sit down before we put regulations into action and see if we can standardize things a bit more. And maybe, as a few people have suggested, let's get ahead of this and not throw something out and test it out on the industry and hope they can respond effectively. That doesn't work very well. And the other thing is it's getting very complex to manage the regulations that are out there today. And the more you add, the more costly it gets and the more potential for problems. There's only so much you can do at a particular time, and it gets very hard to manage. A high degree of industry interaction is required. We've been doing that, I believe, through our associations, the Interstate Natural Gas Association and also the Canadian Energy Pipeline Association. There is a higher degree of interaction around major issues, and of course reliability, pipeline integrity, and so on are major issues. And finally, technology development. We're a highly capital intensive system. Technology plays a big role in that. TransCanada on an ongoing basis spends money in our research and development of technologies to improve our operations, to improve our safety, and so on. And what we've been doing, and there's some associations we belong to where we can bring our members together, and the Pipeline Research Council, for example, where you can bring pipeline operators together and focus on R&D. But the value of the PRCI is also the fact that government agencies get involved in that as well, in funding. And I would say that's a really important aspect of this, is joint funding of technology development is really important, because what it does is you not only jointly work on it together, but there's a joint understanding that's developed as the technology becomes more feasible. And by doing that, you're able to bring technology to use much more quickly, because all the parties are at the table that matter, and you can work your way through it. And having government and so on fund it too puts a little money in the game, so people are more driven to be at the table and make sure it works. So, challenges to reliability in the near term. Some of this will probably not be a big surprise. Increasingly complex regulations. Doing maintenance around pipelines is getting harder because there's more things you need to do to just get permission to go and do it. Secondly, the windows of available time to work around the pipeline are starting to shrink. Environmental regulations, for example, may limit the time you can actually go on a right-of-way and work on the pipe for various reasons. But as you start to limit the time you can work on the pipe, it puts a lot of stress on maintaining your maintenance programs. Emergencies. We talked earlier about the need to interact with public and also agencies. But the other aspect is, when you have an emergency, it's not as easy as just going in and fixing it. There's a lot of things you have to do before you can go in and fix it. And it's not always consistent wherever you go. So even trying to deal with emergency can be quite tough. The cost of multiple regulations and requirements, federal, state, provincial, pick your country, pick your state, and so on. TransCanada has 66 different regulatory agencies that it has to deal with. Now, that's part of running a business, so don't take this as anything more than the fact that there is regulatory agencies there and we need to deal with it. But as the number mounts, and as they do things slightly differently, whether it comes to emissions, for example, and how you develop standards and issues around that, and how you deal with them, if one area does it a bit differently than the other, you have to try and bring it all together. And then the question you have as a company is, what standard am I really working to? Is it to the Canadian standard, the U.S. standard, the state standard in New York, or the Ontario standard in Canada? It really is tough. And then you start running into issues around what is appropriate. And so sometimes what happens in our company is you start developing your own standards that generally meet all the standards out there and try and deal with it that way. But this takes a lot of time and effort and is not cheap as well. Finally, demand is outpacing supply and infrastructure. And I don't say supply or infrastructure, I say both, because you really need both to make this work. Demand is growing. Gas is an accepted part of our energy sources, heating, our nice warm showers and so on. Our ability to get power generated on peak days is usually because of gas generators out there. And it's growing. As the GDP goes up, if it goes up 3 to 4% a year, demand will go up, probably not too dissimilarly. There'll be obviously some value through conservation. So if it doesn't go up at 3 or 4, it might go up 1 or 2, but it is increasing. And also the population is spreading out more, so you need to ensure the infrastructure and the supply is there to meet these demands. Looking longer term, highly capital intensive business. A lot of money is spent trying to get projects done. The lead times are growing, the requirements are growing. Again, we understand that you need to go through environmental reviews and so on, but it is not cheap. It is very expensive. It's easy to spend $50 or $60 million on a project and not even know whether it's going to go or not. And when you couple that with the returns we're getting on pipes, and this is my one commercial on returns, and it's a thin business on the return side, probably more in Canada than the United States. But if you're spending a huge amount of money up front and your potential to get the project is 50 or 60%, and the returns are like 8% return on equity, there's not a lot of motivation there. We'll obviously maintain our systems well, we will do that. But if you're looking to build the infrastructure, you have to attract capital to the business. And if your rates of return are less than other rates of return, the capital does not come. In TransCanada, our business in power is growing. The reason it's growing is the returns are better there. And a lot of our money goes over to the power side of the business. So we need to be cognizant that in a growing, developing environment, we need to attract capital to the market. I don't want to get into a circular argument about what's fair and not fair. It's just a simple fact. If you can get a higher return somewhere else, I would personally invest my money in something where I can get a higher return and similar risks. So I just want to make that clear that in a growing market, in a growing environment, and for infrastructure, you're going to need to attract capital. And we need to look at the returns and the capability to earn that return on an ongoing basis. Finally, NIMBY. Does anybody here really want a pipeline beside their house? If you do, let me know and I'll make sure we put one in. Nobody wants infrastructure near them, but everybody wants the energy. And the question is, what is in the public interest versus the private interest? And you know, the answer seems to vary, depending on where you are in the United States or where you are in Canada. It does vary. But the bottom line is, if we're going to develop the infrastructure to meet the demands to keep the reliability there, we will probably have to put things in the ground and build infrastructure. The electric industry will have to put up wires or do something. And if nobody wants it near them, we've got a huge breakdown here. And that is an issue we have to somehow get a hold of. So last slide, honestly. So issues we should really consider going forward is boosting our supply options. LNG, Alaska, Mackenzie. I already mentioned how long we've been working on the northern gas stuff. LNG is really hard to do, and we've actually got 2 projects underway right now. It hasn't deterred us too much, but it is expensive and it is hard. So if we want to bring in more supply, and personally I believe we do not have enough indigenous supply to continually meet the demands as they're growing, so we have to look offshore or in the north, or likely both. We need to consider how we're going to get these things done. A risk-based approach of management of infrastructure versus public perceptions and expectations. I heard a bit of this earlier. But when there's a line break or an issue around corrosion or something, I think there's this impression of the public that the industry is not doing a good job. And I think the issue we have as an industry is we haven't been doing a great job at telling the public how we're trying to manage the system. We can do that, but we also need to work through the government agencies and other agencies to try and get the message out there that the industry has actually got a pretty good record in terms of safety and reliability. And here's how we're managing the business. And it is a risk-based approach. It's not perfect, but it's working. And I think we need to jointly work on a message to get a message out there to the public. Because, you know, when you have an incident, pick the company name and put something down, people generally jump to the conclusion that we're not doing our job, we're cutting costs unnecessarily, and we're putting their safety in danger. And that's something that just isn't true. And of course, the long-term and consistent economic view of the pipeline industry by regulatory bodies in both countries. What does that really mean? Well, if we build a pipe and it goes in on a certain economic assumption about return and expectations of return down the road, and we all understand that on an ongoing basis this can be reviewed. If there's a material change to that, you tend to think twice about putting pipe in the ground. And I think there's a real value in the agencies and the regulators conveying a consistent view of what the expectations and what they're prepared to do on an economic basis. And today, I think it's starting to drift a bit. And when it drifts, it creates uncertainty. When it creates uncertainty, people will think twice or longer about whether they'll put money into infrastructure. And if that doesn't happen, then our reliability starts to slide. So it's one big circle at the end of the day. So those are my comments. Hopefully we have something to discuss later, but I also heard a lot of commonality today. And again, thanks very much. I really appreciate being here.
Thanks very much, Paul. I found it fascinating that you have only 66 regulatory agencies. That's, we went on the crusade at one point in Ontario, and we created a red tape commission to get rid of red tape. Within a year or two, the Red Tape Commission became one of the biggest red tapes getting anything done in government. So it's very interesting when you try to fix a problem. Sometimes you can actually make it worse. So be careful what you wish for, I suppose, in some ways. We've managed to stay relatively on time. I think it's a part of a seminar like this includes time for everyone to talk, and we want to give you a chance to get your thoughts and comments together for the next closed session. So we'll bid adieu to those that are on the web at this point in time, and we'll take a half-hour, but half-hour only break at this point in time. Thank you.
Hope not.
Yeah, no, it's good to circle back. Yes. Yeah, the CPAC is the coordinating council for that's out at George Mason. So that's actually right now.
Well, I got it wrong. Actually, I tried to get it out. She had a bio client. Well, it was fine. I was